As many of you know, my wonderful supporters over on Patreon recently funded the production of a feature-length film-sized critique of Death Stranding. Now, this isn't a commentary where I just blabber on about the game for hours on end. This is a carefully constructed, precisely written, and exhaustively researched video wherein I tackle all of the design elements that make up the game. Needless to say, this has taken a long time to produce, which is why I needed Patreon support in order to achieve it. Thankfully, we achieved that very thing, and the critique is finished. You can actually watch it now over on Patreon for as little as $1, or you can wait just a few days to a week to get it for free here on YouTube. But in this video, I wanted to tackle something that I address in that critique, but explain it a little more precisely than I had the chance to do within that video. Don't worry though, I'm not going to spoil anything about Death Stranding except for showing some later game areas, but it's likely nothing that you haven't seen if you've watched any of the trailers or any coverage for the game. But with that said, buckle up, we're going to get into some numbers, an Excel spreadsheet, and plenty of graphs. If you're a nerd like me, this should be quite exciting. However, if you're not, I completely understand. Rest assured, I will try to make this as digestible as possible. And of course, thank you to The Ridge for sponsoring this video. So what exactly is this experiment? Well, it's something that I've done for multiple games in the past, whether we look at The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, or even The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This all spawned from an interview that I listened to from one of the lead level designers of The Witcher 3 back in 2016. Basically, he described the process by which CD Projekt Red goes through populating the world in order to make it feel alive and worth exploring. I found this particularly interesting because it's something that a lot of gamers won't even think about. It's an unspoken evaluation that many of us place upon games when we begin to explore them. You probably haven't ever thought about the specific placement of encounters within the world, such as when you see an animal spawn or if you see random raiders patrolling the wasteland. Sometimes that is completely random, I grant you that. However, most of the time, and especially in high quality games with excellent world design, these are much more carefully placed than you might expect. And this is what's known in game development as the 40-second rule. Basically, you want to make sure that if you have a game map, every 40 seconds or so, the player is going to encounter something of interest that triggers their mind in a different way such that their thought process shifts. In other words, you want a moment of interest to occur for the player every 40 seconds on average, otherwise the world will feel too empty. And if it happens more frequently than that, the world is going to feel too crowded and cluttered. Now, if you're thinking critically, you're probably aware of the fact that this is a fairly vague standard to which the developers are forcing themselves to adhere. After all, how do you define a moment of interest? Moments of interest are probably going to change for most people. Every gamer is different, and they're going to respond uniquely to different stimuli that you imply upon them. If one gamer is playing through Red Dead Redemption 2 riding on horseback through a forest, if they see some wildlife off in the distance, they might not respond in any significant way, whereas other people who are trying specifically to go hunting finding those types of animals, they're going to respond in a much more excited and jubilant way, whereas other people might just tune it out altogether. Because of this reality, this whole process is not an exact science, which I want to stress very clearly here and now. However, if the same individual with the same expectations is going to go through and grade when moments of interest occur, I think this serves as a relatively good control. So what this experiment looked like for Death Stranding specifically is that I explored 3 different zones of the map, each of which is designed specifically for a different act within the game. Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And what I did within these areas is I simply traversed the map with the tools I had available at the time, fulfilling orders and engaging in the regular Death Stranding gameplay loop. I recorded myself doing this for hours on end, and then I went back through the footage and created timestamps for myself in an Excel spreadsheet to chart out when exactly these moments of interest occurred. And then I run descriptive analytics on all of it. This means I calculate the kurtosis, the mean, the standard deviations, everything. In addition to this, I plot it all on nice, clean graphs and present it to you. And what I found was actually both surprising and exactly what I expected. You see, if you've played Death Stranding for any length of time, you'll know that the world that you explore during the course of the main campaign is much more realistic than a lot of in-game worlds that you would expect to experience. Now, I do think it's important to stress that realistic is not always good. This because video games are video games, and the way in which you engage with them is much different than the way in which you engage the real world. If I'm hiking through the mountains here in Colorado where I live, I expect it to be very meandering, almost a slave to the randomness that is geology on a grand scale. I don't expect many clearly defined paths. I don't expect many things to be easy, specifically if I'm just going into the mountains off trail. Speaking of, you should never do that. That's super stupid, but you get my point. But in a video game, we expect things to be a little more carefully constructed. This isn't even just my opinion. This is something that some of the greatest open world designers in the history of gaming have said very clearly. The goal of an open world is to make sure that it's intriguing and interesting for the player to explore, and that you always have somewhere new that the player is naturally guided towards. You can watch a lot of interviews from the developers of Breath of the Wild or The Witcher 3, or even, back in the day, Skyrim. These open worlds are fantastically well constructed, and they're very carefully arranged, just such that you always have a reason to continue exploring, to go over the next hill, the next ridge, and see what treasures they may hold. But in Death Stranding, that's not really a thing. The world is designed to be much more chaotic and realistic, whether that's intentional or not. And these numbers that I calculated seem to imply that this wasn't exactly intentional, unless it's on some meta level, which is way too big-brained for me to tackle at this very moment. I address it briefly in my full-length critique. Again, subscribe if you want to be notified of when that goes live, but regardless, we're not going to touch on the meta implications of the world's design here. What I mean is that the data I collected seems to imply that much of the open world is randomly arranged. Whether I look at Red Dead Redemption 2 or The Witcher 3 or Assassin's Creed Odyssey, all of these worlds follow patterns, but they're patterns that are very descriptive. So you can follow them, see them, and you can account for them within the data. However, with Death Stranding, most of the data I collected looks like it was randomly generated. In fact, I was so worried that this data was wrong, or that I had just happened to capture a really strange area of the map, that I actually used different samples between these two charts right here. These charts express much more chaotically placed moments of interest and intrigue compared to that of their other open world game compatriots. Everything from the places where they happen to drop rocks, to where streams are located, to where you are expected to turn your vehicle in order to navigate around some large boulder, everything is random. Now sure, in certain respects we would expect there to be some random placement within the open world. After all, most open worlds nowadays are so huge that they are procedurally generated to some degree. Even the world of Horizon Zero Dawn, which was made with the Decima engine, the same engine that Death Stranding uses, was generated procedurally. However, they went back through with artists, as you can hear in the no-clip documentary on the creation of the game, and they touched up where everything was placed. It wasn't just a one-and-done, generate it and walk away process. It was an iterative process where they went very carefully over the entire map to make sure that it was polished and dynamically generated interest within the player. This could be everything from large set pieces in the background to make you interested enough to go and explore that area, or a sound that you hear while exploring another area, to even the generation of monsters or enemies within the map to make sure that you always have something that catches your attention or forces you to think. And I cannot express clearly enough how abnormal it is that Death Stranding doesn't seem to have done any of this. When you're paying $60 for an open world game that's based on exploration and adventure, you should have certain expectations. Specifically, that the world is going to be designed in such a way that it's interesting and is worthy of being explored for the sake of being explored in and of itself. However, when everything is placed randomly, the player has no reason to take the world seriously or to explore the nooks and crannies just for the sake of exploring them. And this is why the open world of Death Stranding feels both realistic and also boring at the same time. Specifically because it seems as though they used the same procedural generation method that they used for Horizon Zero Dawn's map, but they didn't go back over it to edit it in any significant way. They just left it how it was. All the hills, the valleys, the rock placement, the tree placement, the spawning of NPCs and monsters and BTs, everything is randomly placed, and it shows. And for the skeptics, I grant you that this would be one thing if somebody was just complaining about the world feeling boring in comparison to a bunch of other critically acclaimed games. However, the fact that this is verifiable in the data collected directly from gameplay, I think shows that there's a real shortcoming. The fact that for these charts we're dealing with negative kurtoses, the fact that the standard deviations are so high, as much as 50% or above of the mean, shows that the actual generation of these interesting moments is so statistically chaotic that the only way it can be explained is if the placement of those things was in fact random. The question, of course, is whether or not this was an intentional design decision on the part of Kojima and his production studio, or if this is simply a result of technical limitations and perhaps budgeting limitations. This is something I deep dive into in the full-length critique of Death Stranding, namely that there's a lot of things within the game that would point towards the development studio either being too small or ill-equipped to enumerate this world with everything Kojima wanted, or that it's simply laziness. My personal opinion after analyzing a lot of this stuff and creating a feature-length film-sized critique of the game is that Death Stranding actually had a pretty narrow budget and was on a fairly tight time crunch. This is the only way I can explain a lot of the copy and pasted content across the map and the fact that the map is so poorly designed. The antithesis would be that the design studio simply doesn't have any idea what they're doing, but given Kojima's track record and the track record of a lot of the designers he's working with on the project, I don't think that's the most likely option. It seems to me that they were pushed into rushing this game out and that they weren't given the budget to do everything Kojima wanted to do, whether that's a more carefully designed world or even fully implementing the animals that we see in the introductory sequence of the game, which are weirdly absent from the actual game itself. They went to all the trouble of modeling and animating all of these animals for this opening cutscene, and then they're just not in the game at all. Or maybe they are and they're tucked in some corner of the map that I never found in my over 100 hours with Death Stranding, but I don't know. If you ever found any deer in the map, let me know in the comments. So those are all my findings. As you can imagine, all of this data collecting and the calculations that go along with it took a long time to do, and it wouldn't have been possible without wonderful sponsors such as The Ridge. The Ridge makes high-quality, RFID-protected, minimalistic wallets. I use one every single day of my life. My current daily driver is the carbon fiber, and to be honest, I never knew you could get so many compliments on a wallet, but you can. The Ridge has over 30,000 5-star reviews on their website. They have a lifetime guarantee, free returns if you don't like it, and of course, free shipping so that you get it as fast as possible for free. My favorite price. Check them out right now at ridge.com/Luke. That's ridge.com/Luke. And make sure to use promo code Luke at checkout for 10% off your entire order. And of course, I have all of the links in the description box below. But that's all from me. Thank you all for watching. If you want to see the full-length critique, either head over to Patreon right now or subscribe so that you're notified of when the video goes live for everybody. Let me know all of your thoughts on this in the comment section below. Understand that I love you all more than you could possibly know, and I'll see you in the next video.